Good morning, brothers and sisters. My speech is going to contrast what the brother just said, not because of the science fact, but as to how the vision of the indigenous people we see reflected all this situation that is happening in the world, not only in Latin America, but the world itself. First, I want to tell you that only 43 indigenous peoples inhabit Central America. There are 65 languages in Central America. 30% of the population is indigenous. Why am I reflecting this? Because the governments, the system, sometimes says, where are the indigenous? The indigenous do not exist anymore. Why we are going to dialogue with the indigenous? What can they contribute in this? It only has to be seen in the scientific way, not from the knowledge of the indigenous peoples. So, this 30% is more. We have taken it from the official data. When I say of the official data, they are those of ECLAC. I will give you an example in El Salvador, where I come from. My town, by the way, it's Lenca, and until 2014, our existence was recognized in El Salvador. Imagine an entire struggle of invisibility and marginalization we have had there. The data, of course, is much more. In El Salvador, a study was carried out in 2005, where we came to be 17% of existing indigenous people in El Salvador. But nonetheless, this frightened the government at that moment and said, well, how is it possible there are so many? But because us, the organizations, built the question that had to go towards the census. In 2007, we were not asked. They asked their questions. And one very racist question, where they asked people if they consider themselves indigenous because of skin color or why. Do you understand? I mean, that shocked us. Of the 17%, imagine, in 2005, 2 years later in 2007, the 0.02% of indigenous people was reflected in El Salvador. In other words, technically, that is what I am telling you. Technically, this is going to contrast, because sometimes the truth is technically hidden. Then our existence was hidden there. Technically, the existence of indigenous people wanted to be wiped off the map. Nevertheless, there we are, resisting, and we continue onwards. In the zones where us, the indigenous people, are, there exists highly rich biodiversity, waters, and forests. We concentrate the major poverty indicators in the indigenous peoples having riches. High investments in lands of the indigenous people have been reported, but poverty sharpens. Another shock we had. We are told, but how do you say that? Prove, demonstrate that yes, where indigenous people are, there exists biodiversity, and you will keep those natural resources. Because we have been accused many times that we are the promoters of this entire situation. So then we said, well, okay. So we said, well, okay. And we spoke with the UICN. We told them, look, we need to prove to the governments that yes, what we are saying is there. We made a map of Central America. What this map showed, and many people came to work the map, technicians, many from the government, and many of those things were taken from ministries, from the ministries of countries. Most of the data, and it was demonstrated that the zone that's still green is where we indigenous people are. It was proven. So they said, well, before all this, what is the approach you have? So it would still continue to that. Then it will be continued. And I am telling you because in the forums, in the COP, sometimes we have not even been allowed to enter to give our proposals. And it has been a whole struggle. But nevertheless, I believe we have been moving forward. This map has demonstrated, and today they are using it. Many ministries are using this to see the situation, because like us in the United Nations have been moving forward, today the organisms, the World Bank, the FAO, CRIDA, have their strategies, their safeguards for indigenous peoples. Then, when the bank loans says, well, we are going to loan resources, but precaution needs to be had at the beginning because they have indigenous people of prior, free and informed consent. Then they are now using this to see how much impact the mega projects that are being carried out may have in indigenous communities. SICA, to which I belong, are in all Central America, from Panama to Belize. These are the councils and tables in each of the countries. I come from CCNIS of El Salvador. Besides that, we had a problem ourselves, and a problem created as well because of the situation itself of interest of the governments, of keeping us apart. We, the organizations, reach the forums, sometimes not to propose, but to see internal issues among us, and we also did not agree to make joint positions, a big problem we had. Nevertheless, we also moved forward in that. One day we said, well, let us sit and really see what are those issues we have as indigenous people, but we do have to face, and in order to be heard, present proposal that allows us to have more incidents. And that is how the forum Abya is created, where us, the majority of organizations, are in Latin America, from South America, Central America, and some as the First Nations as well, from Canada. Here in the fifth report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change declares the region of Central America as highly vulnerable to climate change. So scientifically, they are already saying it themselves. But we warned them. Well, we warned them. We told them, look, if we take... Because look, another thing they say. But the thing about this of the natural phenomenon has always happened. Of course, it has always happened, because the healing of Earth has always happened. The problem is that the healing it can have in 5 years has been sped up to 50 years. In other words, that is the consequence. They are things that, yes, are not inevitable. They have to happen. But if we are builders and also responsible of all we are doing, things can happen in a natural way and not speed it up like now. Why am I saying this? Well, look, in Central America, we have a problem now. And sometimes the map comes back a double-edged knife, they say. For what reason? We needed to prove that where we indigenous people where natural resources are kept. But that has also worked for the extractive industry to say, oh well, they are natural resources, so we have to go in there. Today, we have more problems in Central America, in La Mosquita area, in Honduras, where they are incursionating. Well, you can see in Honduras how many people have died defending the earth. There we have Berta Cáceres, who has been symbol standing up for the rivers, but nevertheless, governments ignored that. What is said today? Well, the natural resources are there, but how can we go into those natural resources? So today we have, what is it that is done? The fights we indigenous people are having are linked to other illegal ways, such as narco-traffic and other things. But what for? In order to take us from there, and their extractive industries go into make use of natural resources. So here we see it. It is a matter of how, in Central America, It is becoming a chaotic situation in terms of climate change. Let us not talk about the recent phenomena worldwide, because it has not only been here in Latin America, but worldwide. These are the hurricanes. Look, in COP22, the approach of the indigenous peoples is that it will not happen. 1% of the degrees worldwide will not rise. But the government said, no, we have to accept the 2%, and the brothers here can say it. It is an approach that has been put in governments. If we had 1.5%, imagine the heat, the situation we are currently living. When we reach the 2%, what will happen? In other words, sometimes the situation is not measured, but what is done is find a way to keep the matter of the system itself. Capitalist. When I say capitalist, it's not that I am, but rather those are ways of life that sometimes we have to see. Then the extinction. What will happen there? Extinction of the species, shortage of water. That's now the fight will come because of the water. There are places where there is no water, and if exists water, it is contaminated. So that's a big problem we have worldwide, not only in Central America. The displacement associated with the extreme events such as the one we are seeing now. The reduction of the terrestrial carbon sinks. Fewer growth and survival of crustaceans with commercial values of other qualifying organisms due to the acidification of the ocean. Another thing that acid does, the marine species also die. Now you see, well, what is happening with the companies? Yesterday, we were nothing but speaking here in Panama and said, well, there are a lot of buildings, many hotels. That look very good. But will these waters be treated, or will they just let them go into the sea like this? Then what is happening? Will there be someone who will look at the situation? Well, as in every country, almost always that is ignored, when what is intended is nothing more than having tourism and thus generate more money. But well, that is also one of the things that governments must be very careful about. Given the situation we're experiencing, well, and the brother also referred to this. This is what I'm also saying, which is the shortage of water and urban floods. Food production is also scarce. Look, these are the phenomena that are being experienced right now. This year we have lived through all these phenomena. Yesterday I was also reading that they said that some of these things were created. It was not even natural. They were also created. We will have to see that also scientifically if it could have been given. Look, these are the recommendations that the IPCC made. For adaptation to succeed, it must be adapted locally, aligned with mitigation and development strategies, and must address the different social and environmental stress factors in a holistic and fair manner, something that is not happening. That is not happening because I'm going to maybe bore you by telling you that it's because of the same economic model that countries are living. The some economic model, call it one or other ideology, but when it comes to the system absorbs that, and what it does is that these governments end up doing favors for the systems and calling the big companies. We as indigenous peoples have our normative framework, and that has cost us, as I say, the first sisters and brothers who went to the United Nations had to sleep outside without money, and sometimes they were not allowed to enter the discussions. But nevertheless, those women and men who were there, and that many are no longer with us, but they left us this legacy, because its impact there is what has allowed us to have a legal framework at the international level that now allows us to fight for that and claim it in each of the countries. There we have Convention 169, which is an agreement that is binding on governments, and it's the one of which they are afraid. Central America, Panama, and El Salvador are the only ones that have not ratified it. There is fear. There is fear because there is talk of land. Speaking of land, in El Salvador, a legislator, we were there to receive the constitutional recognition. Look, do not talk about the convention here, because talking about the convention is like pouring holy water on the devil. Yes, interests are coming. He told me, he was very, do not talk about that. Talk about being recognized, but do not talk about agreements or rights. Especially in El Salvador, that the lands, the indigenous peoples, there do not have land. There are few lands that are cultivated collectively, because we were stripped of them. So taking this agreement there means to dialogue with the government so they can, not to return, but perhaps of the surpluses that many people have, they can give collective lands for the indigenous peoples. There is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is not binding, but it's more advanced than Convention 169, because Convention 169 still did not talk about extractive industries. We did not talk about the problems we had at the time. The declaration already speaks of that, so that's why many countries do not want to make it a law, but they want to keep it as only Bolivia has declared it a law, to claim the rights that have been denied to us for a long time. Recognition of indigenous rights in international documents on climate change. Look, this has been an odyssey. The Paris Agreements, the indigenous peoples, and as I said, as Abya Yala Forum, we're also coordinating at world level with other indigenous brothers, and the global group of indigenous people has been formed. We have already presented proposals together, not separately. So we did a whole fight of incidents to present a proposal. But nevertheless, of everything that we present, we only have a little something around there, which is also an issue because everything is a process, where people talk about the knowledge of indigenous peoples, and the preamble talks about the rights of indigenous peoples. That is all in the Paris Agreements of indigenous peoples. It's a matter of, and that does not mean that it was not done. A fight was done so that we indigenous peoples were reflected in that. This is the COP. But the brother already spoke about these situations that are happening at the world level. We have that in table 1. We are talking about this, that there is a sister here in Panama who is very active, and today I told her, look, we started young in this, and today we are already seeing ourselves a bit. We have to think about leaving them to the generation, I said to Florina Lopez, who is a companion who has been there, and she is the president, the one that coordinates the regional level, what has to do with the Convention on 8J of knowledge about indigenous peoples. But here, every law has a loophole, say the lawyers. Although it is true, Article 8J claims right, but also refers that it's based on the national laws of the countries. And in some countries, as in El Salvador, national laws do not, right now there is recognition, but there is no secondary law that regulates that. So that's why I say, every law has a loophole, because in some countries this is also not taken into account because the law says otherwise. We go to Belize. In Belize they say, no, if we have advanced those things. Our laws recognize the autonomy of the indigenous peoples, but that's a lie. These are issues that are being lived day by day. But here we are, fighting, trying to influence, trying to claim all those rights. This is an event we had in El Salvador with the GEAP, the Global Embassy of Activists, where we showed that we indigenous peoples do exist in El Salvador. It was massive. There were more than 2,000 people in El Salvador at that event. We also invited indigenous brothers from Central America. If the government tells us, but what are you going to prove? But we indigenous peoples have always been scientists, and we have proved it. There are calendars of what the vice minister was talking about today, which was also done in orderly fashion, even to plant, even to cut a tree. Everything was done in orderly manner and also allowed, because they tell us, well, today we have to adapt. We always had that process of adaptation because we did it responsibly, the indigenous peoples. This is a work at the Central American level, which we have presented to the governments, which is the Baluwala. It is a way of life that we indigenous peoples have, which is the orderly way of how we see that we can work and dialogue to allow an economy that can allow us. See, because sometimes the problem is that the governments have become existentialists, and that has also caused communities to die with their own ways of life. That is, it's a way that we have also said, no, don't do it. Help. Join. But not only that people are waiting for the companies or the government are going to give us in order to survive, but it's a way of sometimes having us also dominated then. We have made proposals. We have presented the Mesoamerican agenda for the defense of our Mother Earth, where I'm going to try to leave all those documents, as well as the Mesoamerican strategy on indigenous lands and protect areas. That is, we have documents as indigenous peoples that you can see, and it also allows the government to seek which is the best way, the new way for relating that they have, and the dialogue that they can have with indigenous peoples. This is the strategy of the CICA, Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples in Central America as well. Organizations such as FAO have recently recognized that indigenous peoples are key to combating climate change. Organizations themselves are already saying it, when before these organizations said that the knowledge they had did not work, but today they are recognizing it. Science for Climate Change as the indigenous peoples, and I am showing you because these articles that have come out, if I say, they will tell me, well, where do you get it from? There we have it, the work of the indigenous peoples. I will have liked to do it in detail, but I know that later on we have a debate. There we can give feedback what I have talked about. Thank you very much.